welcome everybody. Can't see you, but glad that everybody's able to join. Like Fran said, I'm the Associate Director of the Transdisciplinary Design Program at Parsons, the new school in New York City. I teach courses on speculative design and future studies. My background is actually in design. I've got an undergraduate degree in product and industrial design, and I worked in industry for many years before venturing into the interstitial space of future studies and design. So I'm going to start by sharing a few foundational principles that I like to share with my students at Parsons. You can follow along on the screen here. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the approaches such as speculative design or discursive design. Let's see if I can advance here. So I argue that these approaches straddle between art and design. They decouple design from the expectations to solve problems, and instead they use design to ask questions and provoke much needed discussion, designing squarely in the terrain of the unknown. Discursive and speculative design have points of overlap with future studies, which I imagine many of you are focused on, and strategy as well. And there are numerous related approaches such as design fiction and critical design that also fall in these territories. I won't go into the overlaps, but I'm happy to talk about these connections offline. I put this map together for my students originally, but it ended up being useful for practitioners around the world and engendered a really interesting online discussion. This map is continuing to evolve, and I welcome your feedback and reflection on how these terrains might overlap, connect, or be disconnected. It's also important to note that I see these as approaches, not as individuals or specific practices. So one individual might take any one of these approaches at given times, or merge or mix or invent new approaches within these spaces or around these spaces. I'm guessing most of you have also seen a rendition of the Futures Cone diagram. This one is a version I made, but originally it was proposed by Joseph Boros. There are countless versions of these with lots of different numbers of P's that we can add to the probable, the plausible, the possible, the preferable. And I think this is a really useful diagram. I also have a few issues with the diagram, and I wanted to share a few of my thoughts here. First of all, I think this diagram hints at the notion that our futures expand out to infinity. This cone suggests that things keep moving outward and outward. I think this notion, for me, negates the fundamental concept of futures, which are really fictions that we imagine, that we craft, that we shape for use in discourse, building consent, and forming plans. And so I've proposed an alternative that I call the narrative futures cone. This really suggests that futures are products of our imagination, and our imagination has thresholds and limits. This diagram, I think, reminds us that we must exercise our imaginations in order to expand these limits and thresholds. We need to push our imaginations forward so that we can imagine with capacity longer-term future scenarios. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk a bit about the practice that I run briefly before going into the reflection on Elliott Bolding. As many of you know, I've been running a practice called the Extrapolation Factory with my longtime collaborator, Chris Wolfkin, for 8 years now. The Extrapolation Factory focuses on developing new approaches for democratizing future studies through visual, tangible, experiential media, aka design. We're driven by the belief that all people should have opportunities for their future visions to be heard and considered. So our first workshop 8 years ago challenged a group of non-futurists to imagine and create the inventory of a future 99-cent store in New York City. Participants fabricated objects based on signals, and then we took them to a shop in downtown Brooklyn to contextualize them, essentially to create a suspension of disbelief. So this is the 99-cent shop that we worked with. You can see we've designed the storefront to indicate that there is in fact a time warp opening happening. Here are some of the objects that came out of this workshop. Essentially, assemblages of found objects that become new artifacts from possible futures. We have these objects in the dollar store, and people were able to walk through the store, find them nestled next to some of the objects that were already in the store, and purchase them for 99 cents. So since then, we've developed numerous projects, including a future pawn shop in New York City's Museum of Art and Design. We've worked with school children to envision mobile services for their local neighborhoods in Brooklyn, New York. And we've also crafted scientific instruments for future climate scenarios at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. In collaboration with Stuart Candy and Jeff Watson, we've run workshops to challenge folks to imagine and create inventory for a future vending machine and for a black market. Also with Stuart and Jeff, we opened a temporary toll-free phone line, 88800 number, taking orders of future presents, which were fabricated by participants and then delivered to recipients around the world. So these are all efforts in democratizing future studies through design, making future studies more accessible, inviting broader ranges of folks to participate in these activities. And in the last 5 years, we've been looking at ways to leverage simulation in this work we're doing. We've been experimenting ways to temporarily live in possible futures. Most recently, we invited 20 non-futurists to imagine scenarios to do with our green urban commons. And then we prototyped them in a public space, specifically in the West Side Highway area of the Hudson Yards in New York City, which is a public space that radically transforms our notions of wealth, status, and social acceptance. In an earlier attempt to live in the future, and this is an eerie one, we attempted to simulate a pandemic. We devised this with the help of the New York City Emergency Management Office. And in this project, we surfaced some of the challenges that we're actually seeing emerge during the COVID-19 crisis. So racial bias and discrimination came up as key concerns, as well as communication breakdowns, but also impressive platforms for local heroes to be identified. We used creative improvisation techniques to bring some of the propositions to life in front of a live audience. So most of the Extrapolation Factory's work has happened during what the Emergency Management Office calls blue sky days. Those are days when there's no immediate threat. But with COVID-19, that's no longer the situation. So in the early days of the pandemic, I was actually asked by some of my students if we should all drop our work and shift our focus to the pandemic. And while I think it's necessary for many people to direct energy toward healing and managing COVID-19, I think it's imperative that we find ways to extend a longer view through these times. I've been looking for inspirations that could help us do this better. So many of you who are tuning in today and who may be involved in the future studies community already know Fred Pollack, and you've read his foundational text, The Image of the Future. If you don't know Pollack's work, you probably still have a connection. In fact, everybody who's here was invited to engage in the Pollack game when you signed up, when you registered for the summit. The Pollack game was devised by Peter Hayward and then further developed by Stuart Candy. So you may have already taken part in that. And you know, Pollack he's a legend. He's inspired many people. I think fewer mentions are directed to the translator of Pollack's book. This is Elise Boulding. She passed away almost 10 years ago, before the COVID-19 virus first left across the species barrier from a non-human to one of us. But Boulding, I think, may have something to tell us about this moment. So Boulding was a very dedicated peace researcher. In 1991, Boulding wrote an essay called The Challenge of Imaging Peace in Wartime, published in the journal Futures Studies. I found this essay, started reading it and really found it provocative. And I've spent some time reflecting on Bolding's quandary and the process and the propositions that she put forth in this piece. So before I go into the article itself, I want to first address the tensions that come with some of her work as it can be compared to the pandemic in these times, comparing pandemic to wartime. There are obviously discontinuities between war and pandemic. I think that's pretty obvious. And you know, we've heard numerous thought leaders and politicians refer to the pandemic as a war or treating it like war times. On the media's Brooke Gladstone and Bob Garfield did an analysis of some of the problems with the war metaphor, and I'll draw from that. I want to start with a quote by James Geary, who's the author of I As Another. And he reminds us that our metaphors prime how we think and act. So if our metaphors are priming our actions and our thoughts, we need to be really careful about the metaphor selection itself. We're seeing the Defense Production Act leveraged to force US companies to manufacture ventilators and other necessary goods. Historian Tim Barker warns us of the dangers of relying on militarized social frameworks to get things done. Barker thinks that we should be able to tackle problems without reinforcing the social patterns of war. And here you see the Firestone Tire and Rubber Factory in Akron, Ohio, back in 1944. Eula Biss, the author of On Immunity, says viruses don't have nationality. They don't have politics. This virus doesn't have an intent. It can't be negotiated with, and there will be no truce. And these are all really good reasons why we should be wary of a war metaphor for the pandemic itself. So also from this piece, historian Nicholas Mulder says, we're all Keynesians in a foxhole. A metaphor for a metaphor in this case. But Mulder means that people who don't like government will support state actions like massive government spending to save themselves in these moments where they feel that they're in a foxhole. So if the war metaphor is more provocative as a foxhole, there's a good likelihood that its use will engender more support of massive government intervention. So moving on from on the media piece, and thinking about how times of volatility are leveraged in recent history, I look back to Naomi Klein's shock doctrine. Many of you are probably familiar with shock doctrine. Klein argues that collective trauma, such as war and natural disaster, puts us all into a state of shock, a state through which we may be more likely to follow leaders as we work to pick up the pieces, deal with the grief, care for our communities and our loved ones. And so she argues that for years, political policies that were otherwise untenable have been pushed through during times of shock. To come back to Pollack and Bolding, there are some similarities between the feelings of shock that occur during war and the shock in a pandemic. So uncertainty, human loss, social discontinuity are all present in both pandemic and war. Similar to Klein's thesis in the shock doctrine, in moments of shock, it's not uncommon to experience imagination paralysis. This comes from Pollack. Both Bolding and Pollack wrote about imagination paralysis that occurs in moments of shock. Negative emotional states are really key in a lot of these scenarios. Bolding writes in an essay titled, "Why Imagine the Future?" In eras when pessimism combines with a sense of cosmic helplessness, the quality of human intentionality declines, and with it, the quality of imagery of the not yet. Certainly, the negative emotional states of shock and cosmic hopelessness are apparent in both war and pandemic, and we can find evidence of diminished imagination. So following on this thread of understanding the relationship between imagination and our capacities, I'm looking to Barbara Fredrickson, who's been an inspiration to me in the futures and design work that I've been doing for over 10 years now. Barbara Fredrickson is a social researcher at the University of Michigan, and she describes ways that negative emotions narrow our mindsets to focus on the threats at hand. So Fredrickson calls her work around this the broaden and build theory. She says that joy, interest, contentment, and love broaden our momentary thought action repertoire. Joy encourages play. Interest makes us want to explore. Contentment invites us to savor and integrate. And love perpetuates these urges within safe, close relationships. So when we broaden our thought action repertoire, we're more likely to discover new actions and ideas, and we'll have a greater capacity to imagine futures as an outcome of a broadened thought action repertoire. Certainly, negative emotions have the capacity to conjure future images, futures of all sorts. I think the experience that we have in these negative states are what we can consider as anticipatory grief. And this is when things feel uncertain. According to David Kessler, who's the author of On Grief and Grieving, this negative emotional state is when our minds start to show us images of the scenarios that we fear the most. But I think, as we reflect on what's happening here, I'm not actually sure that this is a creative act as much as a processing of the most salient, fearful images that surround us. A bit different. So if we go back to 1991, there was a surplus of salient negative images shortly after the Gulf War. And this is when Boulding was writing her essay, The Challenges of Imaging Peace in Wartime. In this essay, her goal is essentially to lay out thoughts on how we can responsibly image good futures in dark times. And that's where the title of my talk comes from today. Boulding was a preeminent peace researcher and was focused specifically on imaging peace during war, doing futures work in moments of despair. So I'm going to shift gears again, and I'll pull from Boulding's essay. The atomic bomb, the Holocaust, the incredibly destructive war had the cumulative effect of numbing an otherwise activist, optimistic group of Western countries. Boulding describes Pollack's contribution as setting the West on a dynamic course after a bleak period of self-doubt. During the 80s, Boulding worked with Warren Ziegler to run futures workshops. She was attempting to empower people to imagine a world without weapons. After a decade of holding workshops, she had to reflect on what that empowerment actually meant. And this piece attempts to do some of that reflection. So Boulding's workshops, which were called Imagining a World Without Weapons workshops, were designed to enable people to see what disarmament might look like. I'm quoting again here. Participation involves accepting Pollack's concept of a breach in time, as she calls it, the possibility of abrupt discontinuities in history. Participants step into a fantasy, into a future of 30 years hence. In this future, they find a world in which their best hopes for humankind have come about. They spend time in this imagined future, then come back to report about it, and subsequently analyze what they saw in terms of the institutional infrastructures and socialization patterns that would be required to maintain such a society over time. I love this proposition for a workshop. I'm actually teaching my students approaches to running futures workshops now, and the concept of just entering a future space, crossing this breach in time, and sitting in that space for enough time to understand the socialization patterns, I think is really powerful. In her analysis in this essay, Boulding notes, on the all too infrequent occasions when there were non-Westerners in the workshops, they came out rather differently from the workshops with all Western participants with more diversity. How valid then was the empowerment of Europeans and North Americans? So this next part is the part that I'd like to take a close look at. Boulding writes, and this is, I think, really important, we cannot work for a betterment we cannot imagine. How can we do this responsibly? With a full acknowledgement of the diversity of experience and cultural preference that lies strewn across humankind's path to the future. So here she suggests that we need to take a couple of critical steps to advance our capacity for future imaging in these dark times. First, Boulding advocates for us to find ways to get to know the past. She writes, we cannot responsibly imagine futures without knowing the heights and the depths of human experience in the past. We must know what catastrophes societies have faced in the past and how they have dealt with them. For Boulding, travel was the key. She went reliving the Hiroshima bombing in Hiroshima itself and reliving the Holocaust in Auschwitz. She had come to feel that there were no depths to which the human spirit could not sink when she went to these places and sat with the people there. At the same time, Boulding came to know wonderful people in Japan and Poland who were envisioning, working for, building a new world. Boulding's despair had to take second place to her discovery of the human spirit that could survive despair and rebuild the world. So the second part of her suggestion for responsibly imaging good futures in dark times mandates that we get to know the dreams of others. I think that's a really profound way of framing her recommendation. She says, we must gain some knowledge of the cultures and aspirations of people around the world and engage in cross-cultural imaging. In a period when nationalism and religious fundamentalism and anti-Westernism war with a hunger for technology in many parts of the world, it becomes all the more important to gain some knowledge of what scholars from these regions with a broad training in both Western and non-Western traditions see as possible futures. So I'll conclude the citation from Boulding's work there. And if some of the Westernist framing that you hear in that language sounds dated, keep in mind that she was writing this 30 years ago, almost 30 years ago, in 1991, after having run futures workshops for a decade. So she was in a very particular place. As we reflect on our moment in this pandemic, I think we can borrow from Boulding's suggestions and set out some objectives for ourselves. So how do we get to know past events and the human experiences, the suffering, the loss of those events? How can we better know the dreams of others, of people from different nations, different cultures, different socioeconomic groups, and practice cross-cultural imaging? So moving forward, I really take these challenges seriously. And I'm welcoming input from our community here and more broadly to find ways to pursue some of these objectives. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you so much for joining. I'll open it up for thoughts and comments, questions. I look forward to hearing what you guys have to say. Thanks. Okay. So I'm just flipping through some of the questions. Let's see. Sometimes I worry more about the infodemic than the pandemic. How do we minimize the infodemic? I think that's a great question. This comes from Jose. You know, I think one of the things that we do in the future studies community is to think about better ways for differentiating noise from signal. And this is a task that we are taking on right now, where actually some of the challenges we have in front of us are multiplied many times compared to just weeks prior, when people had other things that were going on. They were not kind of feeding back into these echo chambers like they do today. I don't think there's an easy answer. I think this is oftentimes an art, understanding how to differentiate signal from noise. I think one of the things that I really try to do in my own practice is to think of the work of signal scanning as exercise. You really have to continuously do it. You have to be constantly tracking for signals, sharing these signals with others, and thinking about them as a muscle that you build over time. Let's see, I'll look at some of the other comments. Looks like many of you are fans of Boulding. That's great to hear. She truly was a fascinating individual, dedicating her entire life to peace studies. Are there any insights about how we could treat mental disorders, mental well-being inclusively? I think that's a great question. As we talk about diversity, the conversations around diversity, I think, are rapidly expanding to include issues such as ableism, mental capacities, various perspectives on spectrums, potentially even moving past the human as the defining inclusive group of participants. I think ensuring that our communication is accessible is one of the most important parts. Susan Sontag talks about the importance of communication. Naomi Klein in the Shock Doctrine returns to the notion that communication, parsing information, is one of the most important things we can do to avoid getting stuck in the shock. So I think making sure that our communications are accessible is one of the most important things that we can do. So Ludwig asks, the concept of imaginaries extrapolates past and current circumstances into the future, often restricting free imagination for open futures. Could you relate imaginaries to your idea of reestablishing open good futures in difficult times? I think this is an interesting question. One of the points that I've made many times in past talks is the importance of looking for ways that we can communicate our visions for possible futures in ways that are relatable, that leverage our understanding of the world around us today, but also transform the approach that we take to innovating by examining and dissecting the social rules that we live with. I call this social rule bending. So if you imagine all the current social rules that confine us, that set us up to interact in certain ways, that allow us to live and engage in certain ways, there are many social rules that we abide by but don't necessarily have to. For instance, we, for the most part, go to sleep at night and wake up in the morning. This is a social rule. It certainly has physiological and biological characteristics, but there's nothing stopping us from shifting the times that we operate, the times that we don't operate. Certainly different cultures have already started to push on these social rules. If in times of shock, if in times of radical transformation, we can do a really good look of identifying the social rules that we abide by, and then starting to think about which ones we're able to actually bend away to experiment with radical alternatives. This gives us opportunities to move into territories of the new and the novel that we may not have been able to access during blue sky days. Okay, let's see. From Amr, I'm very interested in the work in the area of experiential futures. Would you elaborate a bit? How do you see the development of this practice? What are the areas that still haven't been explored thoroughly? Great question. Stuart Candy is one of the thought leaders of experiential futures. He has lots to say around this territory. Certainly, Chris Wobkin and I in the Extrapolation Factory have been very dedicated to looking for ways that we can create immersive spaces for teasing out experiential futures and living in the future, as I said earlier. One of the challenges of doing experiential futures work is it's difficult to scale. I think it would be really fascinating to work on projects that are truly experiential, that are immersive, that encompass the body, the spirit, the mind, that do so for larger, broader groups of people. As I mentioned in some of my earlier projects, these projects are essentially only capable of handling groups of, as many as our team is able to work with. So we've worked with groups of 20, 50. Every once in a while, we're able to reach up to a capacity of a few hundred. But the experiential quality of the project certainly decreases as you increase the number of participants. So finding ways to scale experiential futures, I think, is a really fascinating question. I don't have an answer to that. Let's see. Okay, so Caroline asks, in a workshop that uses images about the future, what do you think is the most important to create energy for transformation, create a collective future, debate the different images, understand all the diverse images? I think that's a great question, and you've kind of framed it in two different ways here. So you've identified two different, let's say, goals or drivers for a workshop. The first one might be transformation. And certainly transformation is a critical outcome of many futures exercises, speculative design works. But I think the other one is debate and discourse. And I think before we move into a mindset of transformation, we really need to engage honestly and openly in discussion and debate. We need to walk into spaces and be able to acknowledge that we don't have the answers. As the participants, as the practitioners, if we go into a workshop space, et cetera, with a sense of the right way forward, the direction we must take, oftentimes I think that those workshops end up being a bit more binary, didactic. They don't yield new expansive thought. Rather, they end up kind of driving an agenda of sorts. So I think before we get to the focus of transformation as the outcome of workshops, we really want to be able to walk in with a personal vulnerability, own that vulnerability, and acknowledge that we may not know the right answers. This is not necessarily useful in all cases. There are some scenarios where it doesn't necessarily make sense to go in with an expansive, divergent mindset. So we have to pick the scenarios wisely when we engage in futures work, when we engage in speculative design, and the workshops that build around these approaches. Okay, let's see. Have you ever used images to help people identify, challenge, or create new metaphors? This is asked by Dr. Float. Yeah, that's a great question. I think to speak to one of the earlier questions that was asked, certainly in order to engage people of many different capacities, mental and intellectual capacities, we need to work both in the verbal as well as the image-based. And so a lot of the work that I've done with my students is focused around translating literal verbal concepts into visual, tangible, experiential images that we can respond to without necessarily needing to put them into words. Oftentimes that looks like working with collage, with simple image and shape pattern recognition, and then allowing participants in workshops to start to interpret what they're seeing in those images to build the metaphors of the future scenarios that they're imagining. If you ask someone to tell you a story about a future, you're going to get a story that oftentimes at first comes from a salient set of references that they come with. But if you introduce external stimuli, essentially the food that allows them to expand out on the ideas that they have, they can layer some of their perspectives, biases onto that input, and it transforms the metaphors that they're working on. I don't think it necessarily invents entirely new metaphors. I think it elaborates or builds on the metaphors that they're already working with. Maybe useful for some of the folks who are interested in metaphor to go back to Sohail Inayatullah's work, CLA, causal layered analysis. I know he's a speaker in the summit, and he's done some incredible work understanding the use of metaphor as a way to make change. Santini, hello Santini, talking of blue sky days. How do you expect the appetite from the public and organizations for futures-related work to change during this crisis and after? I think that's a great question. I have a sense that there is going to be an increasing appetite. I think even just the existence of this event and events that have happened in the recent past, I think there's already a desire for more open sourcing of capacities for thinking about long-term future scenarios. I think we're starting in certain parts of the world to shift from feeling like we're under immediate threat and radical transformation every single hour, minute, day, to starting to feel like we understand what we need to do. We wash our hands, we stay inside. And once we've been able to encounter some of these immediate hurdles, we move on. This is going back to Fredrickson's broaden and build theory. We're able to shift into positive mind states and come back to some of the futures-oriented work that we need to do. I think we took such a rapid turn from what felt like for many people in the US, at least where I'm based, as a really solid foundation. I think it may take a long time for people's notion of safety to be radically changed. I think we may be able to pull back from this and harness some of the positive energy, positive emotion that we can remember only a few months ago and channel that into creative work that we're doing. Okay, let's see. An anonymous attendee asks, how do we deter filmmakers from creating dystopian images of the future? That's a really good question. Clearly, dystopias sell, right? And this is a reason that we see a lot of dystopias. I think from my personal perspective, it's a bit unfortunate because every time people go and see dystopian films in the theaters or sit at home and watch them on Netflix during pandemics, those films are integrated into the index, into the catalog of visions of possible futures that we hold. There are reasons that psychologists believe humans gravitate toward dystopias. One of them has to do with the fundamental notion of humans potentially being tribal creatures. And in dystopias, psychologists believe that humans use these opportunities, these fictions, to reflect on how they would reformulate their tribe if they were in a survival situation. So the dystopia is kind of this radical, hyper negative world. A lot of times as I'm crafting visions of futures, I do intend to build futures that are balanced, that have a mixture of positive and negative. But at the same time, I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of the negative. Oftentimes, when we think about the work of futurists, we're looking for people who have the capacity to invent problems that don't yet exist because the scenarios that could give rise to those problems don't yet exist. It's really critical that we invent negative facets to the visions of futures, the images of futures that we perpetuate. But the kind of hands-down dystopia that oftentimes comes out of Hollywood and science fiction is potentially problematic, although incredibly entertaining, at least That's what the box offices would have us believe. Okay, ideas on, whoops, lost that one. Ideas on how to truly foster the positive emotions in times of shock that are conducive to imagining possible futures. I think this comes back to, in part, what Fredrickson is talking about, certainly, but also what Boulding has to say. I think if we can allow ourselves to see the past and to see the emotion of the past, not to cut ourselves off from negative emotion, negative affect, but rather to go back to the past and deeply understand the emotional challenges of the past. Like she was saying, to understand the grave scarring of the Holocaust or Hiroshima, and getting in touch with those depths of human despair, that puts what we're dealing with in perspective. The relationship to the past actually has a really powerful capacity to juxtapose what we're feeling right now with experiences of humans throughout the history of time. It's been said that nothing new is under the sun, and certainly there have been pandemics in the past that might give us insight into what's happening now. But I think it's not enough to just understand the nature of speed of spread, the mortality rate of a past pandemic, but rather to get a sense, or at least to try to get a sense of the emotional affect of those times as a way to better understand how we're coping in this moment. I think we can draw a difference in, or a changed state of emotion in understanding our place in a broader history of time. Okay, David asks, how do we open source envisioning a better future? So that's a great question. That's something that Chris Wobkin and I, through the Extrapolation Factory, have been working on for 8 years. As you can see, Elise Boulding has been running futures workshops even longer than us. Robert Junk is another name to know. Junk had been working on participatory futures workshops in the latter part of the last century. There are countless precedents for working on open sourcing futures imaging and visioning exercises. The question is, how do we envision better futures? Better is really a subjective question. Alexander Daisy Ginsburg did a PhD on what we mean when we talk about better. I believe she's working on publishing some of that work now, so keep your eyes and ears peeled for that work. But the question of better, I think, really comes back to Boulding's suggestion that there is no one singular better for everybody. Everybody has a different perspective on what futures work and what futures don't work. What feels better to them is not necessarily better to the next group. And so when we think about Boulding's suggestions for us, she promotes this notion of cross-cultural imaging. I think that's super important. I think we need to be doing more cross-cultural imaging. We need to be collaboratively working with folks who are coming from very different backgrounds from us to do this work together. Okay. How can future studies methodologies be adapted to different cultures? This is coming from Manahil. And beautiful question. I actually just had a really potent conversation with a colleague and friend of mine, Kibale Kamara, who joined my speculative design course at Parsons this past week. Kibale is originally from Sierra Leone, from a small village called Dunkawale. And Kibale has worked extensively to think about how some of the methodologies that are commonly used in the West might land in cultures that not only have different capacities for engaging with technology or the internet. You can imagine there's very little internet connectivity in some small villages around the world. But beyond that, a different sense of how we think about time. certainly in this community, we're no strangers to the notion that time is a construct, and that not all cultures think about time in a linear manner. So the folks that Kevule works with in many of the workshops that he runs actually think about time in much more expansive and nonlinear fashion. So instead of thinking about the future being ahead of us on a left to right time horizon and the past being behind us on that same time horizon, we can start to think about events that are visible and events that are invisible. And some of those events that are visible might take place at a later date. And some of those events that are invisible might have happened before us. We might not necessarily be able to see the past, even though it may have happened. I think this is a really sobering reframing of time. There's another notion that that actually time is cyclical or working in some sort of spiral, which I think is interesting. But Kevule's experience with folks from his hometown actually hints at this notion that time feels more like a rhizome or a network, that these things are all interconnected, that we can start to build kind of clusters of events. And that's maybe more useful than thinking of them in terms of specific markers on a linear timeline. Okay, so Mary Beth asks, what happens after these futures workshops? Do the workshops involve guidance on to next steps? That's a great question. I think there are so many different reasons for running workshops. Our work through the Extrapolation Factory is really focused on building agency in communities and helping these communities think about their relationship to narratives of possible futures. So the way we evaluate the work that we do is by coming back to these communities and understanding how their perspective on futures and crafting futures narratives has changed between the time before they walked into these workshops and the weeks, months, years after they emerged from some of these workshops. And we've gotten some really heartening and affirming responses from participants from these workshops. That said, we do really focus on making space for reflection on what we've actually discussed during the workshop. And so in the examples that I gave with the Emergency Management Office in New York City, as well as with the focus on New York City parks, we always make space for a roundtable discussion that allows us to pause the play, the dreaming, the fiction that we're in, and return to the now. Return to the now and think about how we can implement some of the ideas that we've talked about into the work that each one of us is doing. Also to critique the work that's come out of one of these workshops. I think it's important to remember that not all future propositions are intended to be enacted or should be enacted. Jim Dater, the former director of the Manoa School for Future Studies in Hawaii, says that any good vision of a future should at first seem to be ridiculous. And I think that's really important to hold as we work on these projects. Some of these visions are not meant to be kind of transformed into actionable plans right away. They probably need processing, and potentially some of the value in generating that vision is to reframe our understanding rather than turning it into a plan. So I think it's important for us to stay away from thinking of futures workshops as forums for delivering action items, and rather to really assessing them as opportunities for shaping the conversation, shaping our understanding of the issues, and shaping our understanding of the others who are involved, relating in new ways and building an emotional connection that allows us to relate in deeper ways. Cool. Thank you for joining me. Thanks to everyone who's out there. I'm sorry I didn't get to connect on all of these questions. Feel free to reach out to me on social media. My social media handle is EPMID, or you can reach me via email, other platforms, LinkedIn, etc.